This video is sponsored by Brush Galaxy. Okay, in 12 different sections in this video, I'm going to give you my best tips, rules and techniques to help you really improve your landscape drawing and painting, whether you're a beginner or a bit more advanced. Now, composition is something that doesn't need to be overly complicated, but I do think it's really useful to bear certain things in mind. Now, whether it's photography or canvas painting or digital painting, I just tend to refer to the rule of thirds. There are other considerations, other things that other people perhaps might consider, but this is the most practical. So whether you're pointing your lens at a real landscape or a real image, or whether you're constructing one, dividing it into 9 separate areas, as shown, is really useful. So literally, we divide it into thirds on the horizontal and then into thirds on the vertical. And then you can see we have 4 focal points or focal areas that you might want to consider adding a point of interest. Now, these are not hard and fast rules. You don't need to stick slavishly to this, but when a landscape or where an image tends to work, it's because some element of it seems to fit within this somehow. So I'll show you some practical examples. We've got an image here. Now, it doesn't fit perfectly, but you can see that it does roughly align with this concept. So the sun, again, not something that was lined up deliberately or certainly not super consciously, but with enough practice of creating landscapes, then you start to learn what looks harmonious, what looks the most interesting. And the sun, you can clearly see there, is not exactly on that focal point, and it's not exactly on that first line that goes vertically, and the horizon is just a little bit below that exact line, but you can see that it does, roughly speaking, stick to those proportions. Another example, one of my more kind of science fiction, fantasy based landscape tutorials, you can see we have a couple of focal points here, and they are roughly aligned with those points of interest. Maybe you could argue that that is almost like a horizon line too there, so you get to the kind of ground level where everything kind of meets, and maybe roughly in that area. And if you were to flatten the kind of dips up here, then maybe that kind of cuts through the kind of roughly kind of the middle area there. Again, it's not a hard and fast rule, but something that is useful to consider. And sometimes it can be more subtle. So I've got another example where we have the top of the water there, the horizon line that is only subtle, and if I remove the template, you can see that the mist on top of the water, where the water meets the land and the trees, there pretty much lines up with that line. And we also have the sun and the light that cuts across there that kind of conforms roughly to the top line too. And also these trees come in so far, and then they do extend a little bit beyond that third line, but roughly speaking they do kind of conform to that too. Another example, again, not exact, but you could say almost the center of that tree is on that third line over on this side. Less so with those 2 lines, but they're not too far off. Certainly this one, roughly speaking, is kind of in that zone. Again, when these images were constructed, I didn't have this template open. It's just the way that the images naturally seem to gravitate when you've a little bit more practice with considering this rule. And again, you can see a point of interest with the tree. It's kind of roughly in line with that line there. The sun is not on the focal point, but it's within the region. And you can see how, practically speaking, it can be used to think about dividing up a landscape. So when considering a new image, you might just, even something very, very rough like this, and just considering those points, when you're thinking, well, I want to do the horizon line, the distance, you might want to do it there towards the top. You might want to have something that's more in focus, focal point, maybe it extends up there as well. Maybe you want the sun in the image and it could sit up, not on the focal point, but on that third line too. And there's various different ways that you can construct a landscape based on that. It's definitely worth bearing in mind and considering, especially if you are constructing something from your imagination. But also, if you are photographing an image, think about these proportions too, and the way that you can compose it. Okay, so the next thing we're going to consider is perspective. Now, we are referring this to the natural environment and natural landscapes. If you were doing perspective in an architectural landscape, then you might want to have a vanishing point, and then you would have various lines that come from that. These are only rough, but you would obviously use that vanishing point to help create the sense that buildings were going off into the distance, for example. But that's not what we're considering within the space of this tutorial. We're thinking about it in terms of just helping the illusion of distance. So the best way to think about it is when things get further away, they get closer to that horizon line. For example, if you were doing a rock feature, it would be further away from that. And it would obviously also be larger because it's nearer to us. And if it's even bigger, it might just go off the frame. Now anything that's really further away, or maybe a more middle distance, would creep towards that horizon line. And anything as it gets sort of like super distant would get even smaller. And just adjusting it towards that line and decreasing the size is really an easy way to create a sense of distance with objects. So whether it's rocks or trees, so if it was a tree and it was in the distance, it might be just really close to that horizon line and it wouldn't extend much beyond it. And then as you get closer, the base of the tree of trunk would come further down from that horizon line and it would be taller than it too, for example. And obviously as we get closer, the base of the tree further down, and usually you would see more of the height creeping up towards the top of the canvas area too. Just blotting this in very roughly just to give you the concept. And if anything was really close to us, then you might only get the edge of a tree that cuts all the way from the top to the bottom of the canvas area. But usually speaking, we're looking for something that might roughly be contained within the frame when you've got a super close-up detail like this. And like I say, as it gets further away, both the base and the top of the tree reduce in size and get closer and closer to the horizon line. It's very easy to convey a sense of distance that way. And obviously they don't need to conform to the vanishing point. The vanishing point is irrelevant. It could be a tree over here, could be another one over on this side. It pushes it further back wherever you happen to draw it. And you could obviously do a really nice big expansive tree right in the middle. Like I say, it's got nothing to do with the vanishing point, and it just helps create a sense of distance. So that's in terms of location, position. So let's just look at that rule within one of the images, for example. So we have a slight anomaly here because we've got a rise, and so it pushes the base of the tree upwards. But you can certainly see that the top of the tree is above anything that is further back. So these are the foreground trees, and you really create that sense of foreground by having them nearer the top of the canvas. And likewise with the rocks that are really big and go off the edge of the canvas, and as they get slightly further away, they're nudging up towards that horizon line, which in this example is somewhere around this line. So as things get further up there, and if I was to add any more rocks, for example, it will be smaller and closer to that horizon line, and it really pushes them into the distance. And likewise, those trees start from nearer that horizon line and push up, but they don't go very high up, unlike things that are a bit closer to us, and they will push up further. Obviously, the base of the tree starts lower down from the horizon line, and it even extends up out of the canvas. All the details are bigger, obviously, and then this one, the horizon line, the trees are really representing that distant area, so they grow from there, but they don't go as high up. And then we have this one. Now this is subtle because the horizon line will be there, and these don't really come a lot further down, but they aren't representing anything really super close. But even there, you can see that they extend higher up, even the smallest tree. And there's certainly the biggest tree is way up there. And these are more condensed. They start on the horizon line and they don't go as high. And we'll just go to the last image. Obviously, we have large flowers here, and as you get closer to that horizon line, they're going to start to become smaller. When it comes to landscapes, picking the right colours is a crucial part of the process. Now, here within PROCREATE, there is a way that you can just input a colour palette from a photo. So you can go to the colour circle at the top, click the plus symbol, and then you can go New from Photos. And then you can just choose one of your photos, for example, and it imports a colour palette. Now, if we were to put in that image and have a look at the colours that it's given us, we can see certainly some of the colours, for example this darkest colour we have on the colour palette, will probably line up with some of the darkest colours we have here. But even then, I'm sure you can notice that there are colours that are darker within that photograph. So it gives us a kind of snapshot of the likely kind of colours, but it won't be exhaustive. It won't give us every single colour. Another example would be up in the sky area. We've got really seemingly rich colours. So you can go for the richest blues that we have here, perhaps that one, but it just doesn't match up. So in some senses, it can be a help to import from a photo, but it doesn't do the full job for us. And even an imported colour palette file that somebody else has created for a specific image can be useful if the person is there to explain which colour is for which area. Now, obviously within my tutorials, I go through every single colour at every single stage, so that is done for you. But when creating your own, there are general rules that I will apply when creating a colour palette. So, first thing I would do, I go to the colour circle, create a new palette, perhaps go to the colour disk, clear, so we're uncluttered, we have a nice new empty palette to work with. And I will break the image down into layers. So the first thing I'm going to do is think about the very distant part of the image, which inevitably is going to be the sky. Literally thinking this is the closest object to us in the scene, which will be a flower, and the most distant thing will be the atmosphere and the sky in the background. So literally I'm going to go for the darkest colour in that environment, and that's my first colour. Then I'll think, well, we've got a dark colour, but it does gradient into more vibrant, lighter blues. So instead of going straight to the lightest version, I might go midway. And then, still only thinking about the blues, not about the cloud in any sense, just the blues, I'll go for somewhere where it's not cluttered by the clouds, about here. And then we've got three colours that kind of represent the gradient of just the very background sky. But then we have clouds as an extra complication. So I think probably in this instance, for example, I'd go for the brightest colour and add that there. And you notice by doing it this way, you have them in order as sequence, so that when you come to recreate the image in some way, or just use it as an inspiration, then they are actually ordered in kind of roughly a way that makes sense. Now, obviously you've got lighter versions of that, which is fine, because if you're using something like the soft brush with an airbrushing, turn the opacity down, then the lighter versions of that and then building it up, you see you're going to get approximations at those kind of colours. I've not created the right texture there, it's just for showing you the colours. So that deals with everything up until the distant clouds. Then we have foreground clouds. Well, let's go for the darkest bit of the foreground cloud, which you might think is very similar to the distant sky colours, which it may be, but it's still worth doing it as a process on its own. It's going to be subtly different than any of those colours there. Then we certainly have a brightest colour in the sky, which is probably near enough white, but let's go for a contrasting colour that isn't quite that extreme over here. And then I suppose if we want to, because we're likely to have a white in the scene, go for one of the brightest areas, and you can add that there. So then you've got two or three colours actually that represent the more foreground clouds. Then we're going to zoom in to the next distant thing that isn't the sky and the clouds. Well, we've got some distant kind of mountain range, so I'm going to grab that colour, maybe start a new layer. Again, this is the coherent way of structuring, and it does have some white on there, but we've already got white, so I'm not going to repeat the whites. There's no point adding whites just for the sake of it. And perhaps we have a slightly darker version there, so we've got some variation in that background. Then we've got the next distant hills. Now you can see there's a bit of texture there, so there's a little bit of variation, but when we're in the distance, you're not going to see too much of it. So maybe two colours would represent that. And then we need to just zoom in, maybe get a lighter colour, and you can see on the little colour disc, the previous colour underneath and the fresh selection on top. If there is a distance, then that's going to be sufficient to create a little bit of texture. Then we've got more closer to us. Again, let's zoom in, maybe just get two variations, go for a lighter and a darker, and that's enough variation for texture too. And then we're quickly moving into the more foreground, middle distance probably initially. Let's find a suitable area. Now we're still not quite at the really dark colours, although we are definitely getting some dark colours. So let's go for probably the darkest colour over here. Maybe we'll start it or continue on this line even. Then go for something in the tree. If it doesn't seem like it's suitably different, then just keep selecting. There you go. And then on the ground, on the grass, we've got a nice vibrant green. And that should give us most of that kind of distant grass area. And then we're moving swiftly into this more foreground. So let's go to that. Well, we're probably going to need to pick the absolute darkest colors. Then we can pick sort of very dark green. And most of these colors are going to be quite rich compared to some of the other greens that we've used. Even this green is just a bit richer. And then you can just select a variation, a selection of these different colors. So these are just a bit zingier, a bit more rich and potent than some of the colors there. And obviously, if you've got details like flowers, you might want to select for some of those. And we've got a nice path here that we can't ignore. So let's select a couple of colors for here. And then at this point, I just have to look at the image. Is there anything that's not been selected for? Well, maybe the trees, just a couple of extra colors we could tag on the end somewhere else if we absolutely needed to, and just keep a note of what they're actually for. So that's the kind of process, the kind of approach that I would use for selecting colors if you have a referenced image. Now, if you're making an image up from scratch, obviously that is going to be a bit more complicated, but I would always recommend that you do have some kind of image to actually inspire at least the color choices, so that when you have this sense of distance created through color, then it's going to be the correct kind of believable colors. And also you don't go too far, you don't choose really exaggerated colors. Now, if I was creating something with the sun in here that was creating a really atmospheric, rich, vibrant glow, say maybe in a sunset or a sunrise. Now this image doesn't really work for that, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I'm going to add another layer, change the blend mode, normal to add. And if you wanted to create warmth in the scene, I might go to my colors, might go to the disk, go for something really super vibrant like a red, just a hint towards the orange, maybe select that, maybe just a really yellowy, rich orange too. Go for the red, go for something like the airbrushing soft brush, large size and a very low percentage, and you can start to build in a glow like this. So you don't need to necessarily create a whole color range, a color, variations to create effects like this. You can put a kind of artificial glow or a sunrise glow in there. Go for the yellow orange, maybe reduce it down, turn up a hint. Now, I'm not giving you exact instructions on how to do this. I'm just showing how a couple of really vibrant colors like this can be used to bring in a kind of secondary light or color scheme, like so. Now, it doesn't really suit the actual scene here, but it's just an example. So even if you're using an image that does have this kind of real warmth in the sunlight, then I would tend to stick around the peripheral, choose the colors from this area or this area, and then just as I've shown you, add that warmth, that glow after as a second kind of effect. So don't, for example, start thinking, well, I need this warm color here, I need this warm color here, I need this warm color here. Actually, it's not necessary. Choose the color scheme from the edges where you've got a pure, unaffected version of all the colors, and then you can go and add the glow and the warmth with some really vibrant colors with a fresh layer put to the add blend mode. And that's generally how I would use and select colors and how I would recommend people do so. Now, another way of creating distance is the use of blur. So if we're using a camera, for example, and we're used to seeing images created by cameras, then usually the depth of field would allow quite a lot of the image to be in focus, but you might have an area that is more in focus than others. So in an image like this, it might be that the clarity is over in the kind of tree area, but it might be that something close up, like the rocks, actually contains some blur. So the depth of field is more in that distant area and just blurred out when it gets closer to us. And that really kind of pushes the sense that we have things going off into the distance and then things coming really close to us, which again just increases that sense of distance and forced kind of perspective. Now, it's quite subtle on this image and it's just on the peripheral, just on the edges. So the way I would generally do that, I mean, I've got the whole image condensed as one flat image here at the top. So if I deselect everything else, you can see it's all on one layer. You might choose to do this as a separate layer for each detail, and that's fine. But let's just say it's a flat image. Go to the selection, freehand, and then again, I'm just going to select the foreground area, close the loop, go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and just blur it in a couple of percent. And I'm just exaggerating it a bit further, just so you can really see the point. Deselect everything. and you can see now it really has blurred it out, and it's kind of pushed the clarity more off into the distance. And again, it just helps create that sense that there's a difference between here and here in terms of distance. And you can really go to town. So we've done it to a certain point. We can go to the selection rather again, freehand, and then just to push it even further, just maybe a shallow, slim area there at the bottom, close the loop, adjustments, Gaussian blur, push it even a little bit further like that. And you can see it really has ramped that up and really helps create that effect. Pushing the eye more into the distance, there's definitely a difference between these two areas now. Alternatively, if you wanted the focal area to be somewhere in the kind of middle area and you wanted a shallower perspective and to push these distant areas or these hills, mountains into the more of the distance, again, selection, freehand, be a little bit more discerning, just a little bit more careful, trace around them, for example. You don't want the tree edges to be blurred out, and it might be something that you do as a separate layer anyway, but just to give the sense, just trace around the trees, close the loop, adjustments, Gaussian blur, and then blur that in a bit more, maybe to 5% or so, deselect, and again you can see it's pushed them back and brought these forward in a slightly artificial way. It's created a shallower depth of field, so a slimmer area that actually is in focus. But again, it works for creating that sense of distance. I'll just zoom in so you can see that even more clearly. I mean, if you wanted to create some real kind of movement, you could go to the selection, or rather the adjustments, perspective blur, put it somewhere central where you wanted the focus to be, and then just slide it across. And then it kind of just focuses your eye more into that center area and blurs everything off. I think it's more of a case of creating movement and an intense look. It's a little bit too much probably, but it can be used just to really sharpen the focus in a certain area too. Less about distance, but again, it does kind of help with that too. So in this example, we've got a really foreground feature, which obviously is super in focus compared to the background, which is really blurred out, to push it further away and create that sense of difference between near to and far away. Important aspect to think about when creating a landscape is the level of detail that you need to go into for every area. So for example, on an image like this, there is a lot of detail, there is a lot of texture in certain areas, helped by the process and technique that I showed you during the tutorial, certainly. So it was done for efficiency. Some areas have been labored over a little bit longer, but then there are some areas that are in the distance that have a subtle variation in color and tone, and where really they're in the distance, and when we're zoomed out, we get a general texture, but we don't really notice the detail, and it's not as important, certainly in these areas in the distance, for example. And for the vast majority of images, you need to be more selective where you put those efforts and those details. So certainly in this image, for example, anything that's really in the distance you can see is much rougher, kind of more sketchy. The level of detail is not the same as even just this area where the trees are, and certainly where the rocks are in the foreground. And even the things that are in the middle distance, when you really zoom in, they're kind of sketchy. They're quite rough looking in many areas. You can start to see the breakdown of the brushes used, and it really doesn't look quite as good if you're going to blow it up to a massive scale. Having said that, this is created on a PROCREATE A4 canvas, and this is a print. I don't know how well you can see it on camera, whether the lighting is intense enough. Obviously the light comes from the iPad, and this is relying upon the light upon it. But I promise you, printed at a similar scale at A4, the same canvas size that we've created it, it really is actually pretty detailed enough. So the level of detail obviously is going to be relative to the size that you're going to print it, but things that are distant don't need as much detail, certainly. And here's another example. So obviously in the texture, in the grass, in the foreground of this image, we've got a little bit more definition. But as soon as we go somewhere off into the distance, we've not only used the blur slightly, but the level of detail and refinement just isn't there, and it's not actually necessary to create the overall effect of the image. So another aspect might be the light source and thinking about where the light is coming from. So in an image like this, we have an obvious light source coming from the bright and very visible sun, which certainly has an impact, for example, on the edges of objects and trees, and on the water in a very clear reflection, on the edges of clouds. But clearly it's not the only light source, because if it were, then we'd have nothing but warm colours in our scene. So wherever we have, for example, opposing colours, then clearly we have a different light source. Now it may be in some images we have a very distinct and separate light source from a sun. It could be an artificial light, for example. But in this case, we have an ambient light source. So the sun is low in the sky and it's coming through the clouds and creating warm colours. But if you were to pan up or turn around, then the rest of the sky, and we've got a hint of it here, the rest of the sky would actually still be in the kind of blue spectrum. So there's still going to be a lot of ambient light, a lot of general light in our scene that is coming from the kind of blue area. And that's why when we've got something very reflective like snow, we are still picking up the cool colours that are not as visible in this particular image, but you do get a hint, there is a sense that the rest of the sky still will be quite a pale blue, which is why we have it here. Now, in another example, a bit of a fantasy landscape, we've got a light source coming from the glowing mushrooms, and then we've got a light source coming from the sky up here as well. So we've got some of the warm glow impacting on the ground, for example, and you could, I suppose, add it to the edges of trees, but then you've got the second light source that is coming from above and then is catching the atmosphere, bleaching some of the trees out, making them look more distant, and again it is also reflecting upon the ground surface. So here's another example of an extremely vivid light source too, coming from the centre very clearly within the scene, and that is the biggest thing that's reflecting upon the snow. But even then, we notice we've got these cool colours. So we've got a slightly lighter blue and a darker blue. The lighter blue, presumably, is coming from the rest of the sky. So we have an extreme warmth here, but again, if we were to pan round, we've probably got some cooler blues in the sky. We have a kind of dramatic storm scene, so we've got the light source coming from the lightning that is impacting on the clouds, but then again we'll have enough ambient light other than the storm cloud that is picking up on the top surfaces here and isn't really coming from that light source, it's coming from the general surroundings. Now in some scenes, really you can just limit it and reduce it down to pretty much one light source. We've got a very vivid, strong light source here, and almost everything in the scene is reflecting back light from that area. So there are instances where one light source is going to be more appropriate than two. But it's always going to be really important to consider where the light is coming from and just trace the lines, think about how it's going to impact on the surfaces. And then yet in other situations, we don't know exactly where the light source is, and it's just a general diffuse. There's no obvious shadow or objects that are casting shadows, other than perhaps the edge of the water. So we can just assume that the sun is going to be pretty high up, the whole scene is illuminated, and it's going to be less of an issue. So always consider where the light is coming from. Really try to have a vivid sense of the direction of light. Think about, are there alternative sources of light? How is the light bouncing around in the general environment? One more example, again, the light is clearly coming from above because it's impacting the top of the clouds. In something like this, we don't really have a secondary light source. It's the bright height of the day, and then really we're just going to have a dramatic light source coming from here. And then in other situations, perhaps it's going to be more of a diffuse light, and really, we've got a general sense that the light is coming from somewhere above, but it's not incredibly obvious, and it's just softer, it's more diffused, nothing too dramatic. So thinking about the light source, think about where it's coming from, think about the effects that will have. Always bear that in mind, because if you have a very clear idea where the light is coming from, it's really going to inform how you approach the whole image. Another really super important part of creating an image is the use of the brushes and which brushes to use for certain effects. Now, typically when I'm starting with something softer, like transitions in the sky, I will go for a softer brush. So I might go for the soft brush with an airbrushing, and then, you can really build up, gradients in a really soft way, and also make use of the Gaussian blur within adjustments. When it comes to something like branches and tree effects, I would typically use something like the Studio Pen with an inking, mainly because it's pressure sensitive. So if you press on lightly or you press on hard, and always think about the adjustments on here. So for example, if you went to the Apple Pencil settings within the brush, and you want to just make it slightly less extreme, the pressure and the size, so that when you go back in, you know, you're going to get that same variation, but it just doesn't fluctuate quite as strongly. It's just a bit more subtle. And you can obviously set it in a way that works better for you. I might also use that same pen for something like a grass feature. It has a nice sort of natural curve to it as well. Creates the shapes pretty well. You start at the bottom and then release the pressure as you go further up, and you get this natural kind of almost blade of grass shape. So that's a brush I would certainly use for branches and grass blades, for example. More textures, for example, I might use for trees. So apart from the branches, I might go to artistic, something like the Aurora brush. I'll reset it. And once you've got your kind of base color selected, you can see it has a nice kind of broken texture, and really just sort of zigzagging, wiggling it in to the image. You know, you get a lot of broken texture around the edges, and it's just really useful for creating a nice kind of tree texture without really a great deal of effort. And it also naturally creates a little bit of variation in tone, which is super useful too. So I have certain brush favorites for certain tasks. An Aurora brush has definitely quickly become my favorite brush for tree textures. With an organic, the rainforest brush, so we'll choose maybe that color. Go in with the rainforest brush. I'll reset it, choose an appropriate kind of size, and it's just a really good way of getting some nice natural, slightly fragmented textures of clouds, suggestions of clouds. It's just a really quick and easy way of doing that. Although technically rainforest brush, obviously it's, you know, meant to represent tree canopies, rainforest features, but actually for clouds, it's just a really nice kind of broken texture, and you can go on, tap on it, stroke path, and change the spacing to make some of those little elements even further apart. So you can really go in there and just vary up the amount of spacing and little fragments that come off of it too. And then another favorite brush that I use lots these days is the Luminance light pen. And then when you have a strong color, so maybe like the strong yellow, and you have a layer set with the blend mode to add, and just find it a really useful way of creating a really strong light effect. And that can be equally good for stars in the sky if you reduce the size down to really small, obviously. I mean, not that we need stars in this sky, but for example, you know, it's a really nice way of getting a nice glow, as well as sun features and other things too. Now, if I want a kind of rougher texture, then there's all sorts of brushes that you can experiment with. And this is my general advice, is to just go through the brushes, get a feel for what they actually do, and then hopefully it will give you inspiration as to how you can use them. So for example, we've got this Oberon brush. If I reset it, and it looks like this by default, which I guess is quite similar to the calligraphy, or rather the inking studio pen. It does a similar thing. It's almost like blades of grass, and that's fine. You could use it for that purpose. But then look at the different settings within it. So if we go back again, tap on the brush and just change, for example, the spacing, put it a really high percentage, 60-odd%, and then it just does different things, which means that when, you know, you've got a feature on the ground, for example, you want to start adding some broken texture, it just speeds up the process. You don't need to draw every single point of texture manually. You can just make sweeps across a certain area, and it just creates a really nice broken texture for you. I found this particularly useful recently when I was doing some snow texture. In addition, with using the blur, I could just create some kind of particles and broken texture here and then blur it out afterwards. Just a really nice texture, could be quite versatile. So I think all of the brushes have potential. Now, obviously you can download templates, stamps, and they can be really useful too. So we are just using default brushes in this tutorial, but if you'd like to take your art to the next level, you could try premium brushes from Brush Galaxy. Brush Galaxy enables you to unlock over 50,000 premium PROCREATE brushes for a fraction of the price, and you can access over 20 different categories such as fur, lettering, nature, animals, and many others. So for example, a quick search of snow and the results give you tons of different winter and snow brushes, which could be really useful for adding that extra something to your artwork. Start now and get the first 7 days for free, and join thousands of other artists using Brush Galaxy tools to bring their art to the next level. The link is in the comments and in the description. So I've highlighted some of the ones that I do generally use quite a lot in my tutorials, And some of the brushes, for example, like the organic rainforest brush, has a huge amount of versatility. You can use it in many different ways, from clouds to trees to ground texture, all sorts of things. So really dig in there, have fun, just experimenting with them. Now, distance and perspective can also be created using just pure tone. So, for example, if you were doing a landscape sketch drawing, you might just use the weight of line to suggest distance. So if you had a tree here in the foreground, for example, and I'm really only very roughly representing something vaguely representing a tree, you might use darker lines, really be quite firm about some of those details. And then if you're representing something that is more in the distance, you might press more lightly, and then something mid-distance, just something middling tone. And this is just only using a sketching kind of pencil tone. And then anything in the super distance, you might just have really light kind of effects. So it might be that you just get a sense of a distant tree line in here, for example, with some really light tones. And then when we get sort of ground rock features, you might use darker tones, and then distant rocks, you kind of have lighter. You're just using a variation of tone, and I realize that this is not a particularly detailed image, but I'll show you how this could be used in an actual sort of painting in a moment. But you can see instantly where it just doesn't sit right. So use lighter tones to represent things that are in the distance. And things as they come closer to us, we're going to have stronger, heavier tones to bring it closer to us. But if to look at it in a full color version of a similar thing, you can see the real black tones are here in the gaps and the shadows and the darker areas. And for example, these trees generally use darker tones than the ones that are in the middle distance, and certainly the ones that are in the further distance. You should be able to see now that the real black colors are here in the foreground. You've still got some pretty dark tones on the nearby trees, but generally it's used a bit more sparingly. And then you've got something in the middle distance, which doesn't have the dark colors, but it's certainly darker than the ones that are pushed further back. And you can see the same on the ground details, so some real dark shadow textures here, much less as we come further back into this area. You've got a kind of middle grey, and then you've got lighter greys as we go into the distance. So just using tone alone, just the difference between light and dark, we're helping create this sense of distance. And similar to the tonal perspective, when we get things in the distance, with colour, we actually get cooler colours. So not thinking about the light or darkness of the colour, but just the temperature, the colour itself. We'll notice that certainly on a daylight scene like this, where we don't have a strong warm sunset or sunrise, the general atmospheric conditions mean that things in the distance get grey, blue, quite cool, and so you don't notice any warm colours in that distant area. When we get to the middle distance, we start to just get a little bit more warmth in there. We can see that this would now represent the green of grass, but it's nothing like as vivid as the foreground warm yellow green grass areas. So the real vivid warm colours are going to be more in the foreground, and the cooler, more bleached out grey blue colours are going to be in the distance. And that would be the same for colour contrasts too. So for example, on this image, now it is slightly confused by the fact that we have a sun setting, which creates warmer colours. But even within this, you can see that you've got a real contrast. So you've got the vibrant warm colours here in the foreground and cool colours. And then if we just take this section, for example, that is pushed back a little bit more, we don't really have any of the warm vividness anymore. And then as we get further back into some of these areas, with nothing but really kind of cool colours. One more example, perhaps where it's slightly exaggerated, but it gets the point across. You've got the really vivid warm colours here in the foreground, and those same yellow oranges, because of the atmospheric mist, fog, when we get into the distant areas, they're really softened and cooled and just reduced in terms of their fierceness when it comes to this distant area. We obviously have a hugely cool kind of haze that's really dampening down those bright colours in that middle distant area, and a real fiery warmth of colour here in the foreground. But it's not just about the temperature, it's also about the variation. So we've got a real bright yellow, rich orange reds here, and obviously dark colours too. But then as we get further away, they kind of just meld together, mush together a little bit more, and have less variation. And another way of creating that distance is using atmosphere. So unless it's an extremely crisp and clear day, the atmosphere is going to have an impact. Certainly on a kind of more misty, foggy landscape like this, another way of creating distance is to use atmospheric conditions. So we can really push back those trees, for example, using the kind of general haziness, the kind of fog. And we could even do that further. So if you grab it and you go in something like the airbrushing soft brush, you can see how easy it is just to knock back trees, just to push them further back. It really then creates a separation between these ones and those ones there. Now it doesn't work for this image. I think the balance was just about right before I did that, but you can see how the addition of atmosphere can actually be used to push things further back. And here's another example. We've got a low-lying mist, and it just really creates a separation between anything back there and then this tree detail here. And it's also a way of creating separation between the ground textures. So you can still see the ground textures are there in the distance, but the atmosphere, this mist, this fog, has kind of just gradually pushed it further back with the airbrush. And you can see it's very easy just to push sections of it further back using this kind of atmosphere. If you really want to exaggerate the difference between some areas, you can just knock it back really easily. And as soon as you delete it, it just brings it further forward again. And again, another example, you can see that we've used haze and fog just to knock those trees really much further back. And if we delete it, you can see that they just encroach on us much more dramatically. When we put that back in, it just knocks them further back. So you can really increase that sense of foreground, background using atmospheric conditions. And clearly the same with this image. So we've got some nice rich detail and colors here, and then as we get further back, we're using that atmospheric, not a particularly clear sunny day, and we're using it just to help recede and push back those distant areas. Okay, probably the most important tip of all, really, that people have a strange attitude towards, I find at times, is the use of references. Now, I strongly recommend the use of references. I think that it's very difficult to learn, very difficult to start down the path of creating believable and realistic scenes and environments without looking at images. Now, you don't need to copy an image slavishly. You can use it just as literally a reference. So whether it's from taking the color palette, looking at how atmosphere is used to create distance, looking at the difference between the vibrant colors and the cooler colors, looking at the different ways that compositions can be created in successful and beautiful photographs, looking at the different kinds of textures, the level of detail needed to convey it. All of these answers are locked in within reference images. If you start with a blank canvas, it's very intimidating, very difficult to actually progress. The best way of learning is to use a reference image, if only to analyze it and to figure out and unlock the secrets of the things that make it a successful image. So do not be afraid to use a reference image, even if you don't copy it exactly, even if you're just using it as just a stimulus to then create your own thing. I think it's important to have images to hand. I think somehow people feel that you're a better artist if you don't look at anything and you're just pouring it out of your own imagination. But I just think that's silly. I think that's a wrong-headed approach. I think it's always better to surround yourself with material, inspirations, things that are going to nudge you and help you feel inspired and get the ideas to make your images better. So yes, do use references. Now I've just got some extra tips here at the end, just quick ways of creating effects that can be really quite effective. So the first one would be, if you've got a scene like this and you've got the top level of detail, is to simply go to the selection, maybe a rectangle, grab everything in that top area, then 3 fingers down, copy, 3 fingers down, paste, and then you've got a duplication of it on a separate layer, flip vertically, and then just push it down so that it lines up, and then very simply go to the adjustments, motion blur, and just slide that to the side, and you can see you've instantly created a kind of water reflection of what you had before. Really super quick and simple way of creating reflection in water. Then obviously you can add other details on top, like I have here. Another really good thing that you can add, especially if it's kind of like a overcast day, you could add another element to this. You can go to the top, in this example, create a new layer. I'm going to pick a white or near enough white, maybe go for a medium hard brush within airbrushing, put it down to a small size, 100% opacity, and then you can just create some dots. Again, it doesn't need to be hugely deliberated over. You're not going to see them in the white area quite so much, so just maybe just focus your energy in the areas that are going to be more visible. Once you've filled up one area, you don't need to do this across the entire thing. Maybe just pick a section, do some dots, some, you know, honestly, they're little squiggles, but it doesn't matter. That's not going to affect what we're going for at all. Once you've done that many, you might only just slide and duplicate, transform, flip it horizontally, move it across, pinch them together. Whoops, bit tricky. Pinch them together, slide and duplicate again, and then to the transform and slide across, pinch together again, slide and duplicate and just transform across. And then last time, pinch them together. Bit tricky to tap on it and merge down instead. Once we have created those dots across the entire scene, to turn this into rain, just go to the adjustments, motion blur, and then just maybe it's a diagonal, drag it down as much or a little as you want. And now you can see that you've added this sense of rain into the scene. And it's on one layer, so you can slide and duplicate it to really bring it out. Maybe you can go to the transform, move it around, stretch it out, or perhaps you can just double up that effect, put it wherever you want in your scene, like so. And you've instantly created a kind of rain effect. Equally, you could try snow. So create a new layer, go to our brushes, go to elements, driven snow. We've still got the white selected. It's quite big. Maybe we'll turn it down 30% or so and just create a smattering of that across. And again, that's, you know, quite dramatic, but you can go in with the adjustments, motion blur, and just slide that across to the side or whatever. And it's just a little bit chunky, a little bit thicker than the rain, but it kind of helps create a snow effect. And we could easily add a sun glow to a scene. It doesn't really suit this environment, but even in an environment where it doesn't quite fit, you can see how easy it is to do. So I'll create a new layer, tap on the end, change it to add blend mode, go to the soft brush with an airbrushing, and I'm going to pick something like a vibrant red, put it quite big, 30% size, not too strong, maybe 10% opacity, and pick an area perhaps where maybe a sun would actually be peeking over in a sunset, maybe there, and just circle that into the general environment. It's on top of everything else, so it adds that glow to the whole scene quite nicely. Maybe think about the reflection, you could add a bit more in the reflection too. Again, this is artificially added. It doesn't quite suit everything in this environment, but you can see it's still possible to change the look of it quite easily. Then go to the bright orange yellow, turn it down, more focused, maybe 5%, still at the low opacity, and then I can just add my sun in there. Again, I'm only doing this very roughly, but I'm adding it into the scene. We're changing entirely the kind of the tone of this piece in a really forced and artificial way. And it was never intended to be this type of environment or weather this time of day. But even then, it's possible to kind of force it in that direction quite easily with this technique. So if you've got a landscape where, you know, a sunrise or a sunset is more appropriate, then this is even more effective. Okay, I hope that's been useful. If you like any of the images seen in this tutorial, do check out my other videos. A lot of the images used are tutorials from this channel. So do subscribe, check out the other videos, and I hope to see you back here soon. Bye for now.